The film begins with a guy named Donald. He's a baker and spends most of his day selling what he bakes. He works all by himself, with no one around to give him a hand. At that time, Donald is also constantly hoping to hear from his son, Pete. It's been about 26 years since they last saw each other. Now Pete is quite a busy guy, but it's a mystery what he's busy with. He was married, but sadly, his wife passed away. Now, it's just him and his daughter, Delphi, living together. Delphi is a quiet kid and doesn't really get much attention at school. Then, out of the blue, Pete shows up at her school and takes her out of class to leave town. At that time, Delphi has no clue where they're headed, but she's sure it's going to take them 2 days to get there. Surprisingly, Delphi can't talk. She can only listen and nod in response. This trip has her pretty surprised, since her dad isn't usually the type to travel far. Switching back to Donald, he's still in the groove, getting his bread ready to sell. Just as he's about to open his shop, a car pulls up. At first, Donald thinks it might be his first customer of the day, but surprise, surprise, it's Pete's car, and he's got Delphi with him. The reunion is a bit awkward at first, seeing as Donald and Pete haven't seen each other in 26 years, and it's the first time Donald is laying eyes on his granddaughter. Still, he is hopeful that this visit could turn into a sweet memory. But it's clear Pete's not just there for a catch-up, since he's busy chatting away on his phone. Once Pete hangs up, he tells Donald he wants to leave Delphi with him. At that time, Delphi isn't too happy about this and heads back to the car. However, it seems like she has an idea of what her dad's job involves. Pete then lets Donald know he'll be back in 3 days and asks him to take care of Delphi until then. Before Pete takes off, he says goodbye to Delphi. Since Delphi can't speak, interacting with her is a bit tricky for Donald. In fact, every 10 minutes, he has to ask again what her name is. After Pete drives away, Delphi starts showing her true colors. Turns out she's quite a handful. She can grab money or even mess with her grandpa's work. Donald, who hasn't lost his cool in 26 years, nearly lets his frustration out on his granddaughter. But he catches himself, realizing that Delphi doesn't deserve this. Instead of getting upset, he flips the script and goes out of his way to make Delphi feel welcome and comfortable. A bit later, as the shop was about to close, Donald asked Delphi to help him deliver some ordered bread. But Donald was still feeling a bit uneasy, especially when Delphi insisted he put on his seatbelt. He wasn't used to this kind of attention from her. Basically, Donald was still getting used to the idea of having a granddaughter around, especially one who wasn't as quiet as she seemed. Delphi was quite mischievous, even sneaking some bread, but Donald caught her in the act. Meanwhile, Pete had just reached a fancy house. Turns out, he worked for an international drug dealer named Vic. But Vic wasn't happy with Pete because he had lost something important he was supposed to have stored safely in an orange bag. Actually, Delphi had opened this bag while she was sulking in the car. Facing the consequences of his actions, Pete was in big trouble. But before things got worse, Vic let him make a call to his daughter. When Donald answered the call, he was taken aback. Pete only left a message about Delphi's favorite food before Donald heard gunshots through the phone. This made him suspicious that Pete was involved in something illegal. And when he asked Delphi, she surprisingly revealed some drugs she had taken from her dad's bag. Delphi did this because she was tired of her father's line of work. Without a second thought, Donald hid the drugs in a special loaf of bread. Then, they immediately set off to find Pete. On the other hand, an international drug distributor named John wasn't too pleased with Vic. He was pretty disappointed, as the item that went missing was the priciest one in drug history. So he told Vic to get on it and find that item. A little while later, Donald, guided by Delphi, reached a rental house. Once there, Donald took a moment to chat with a woman who lived next door to Pete and Delphi. She shared that Delphi had been left behind by her mom due to a tragic accident. At that time, neither Delphi nor her mom were wearing seatbelts, and sadly, only Delphi's mom didn't make it, while Delphi lost her ability to speak. After hearing this, Donald understood why Delphi was so insistent on him wearing a seatbelt in the car. Next, he decided to check out the house Pete used to rent. Walking in, he found the place was in total disarray and entirely neglected. That's when it clicked that Pete had been moving from one house to another. Before leaving to search for more clues, Donald let Delphi take some toys that were left behind. Since that day, Donald started getting the hang of Delphi's personality and way of doing things. He also felt pretty happy seeing Delphi warming up to him. But this wasn't really the best time for bonding. So, he headed to the police station to report Pete's passing. There, he met a police officer named Clara, who interviewed him. The thing is, Donald didn't know much about Pete, just the year he was born. Plus, Clara and the rest of the police were in the dark about who Donald really was. They didn't have the authority to dig into Donald's identity, making it hard to gather info on Pete. Clara even had to double-check with Donald if he was really Pete's father. After spending some time at the police station, Donald didn't find any bodies that looked like Pete. Even though the police couldn't offer much help or direction, Donald had an idea of where to start looking. By chance, he ended up at a place where drug users hung out, run by a guy named James. In just a minute, Donald managed to get a bit of information, but he started being followed by guys who underestimated him, thinking he was just an ordinary baker. To everyone's surprise, Donald was actually quite the expert in fighting and quickly dealt with the men following him. However, he made sure Delphi didn't witness any of the rough stuff. He didn't want her to see anything that might shock her. To dodge the mafia on his tail, Donald decided it'd be best to take Delphi and stay in a hotel for a bit. Here, Donald had to stay 2 steps ahead of the bad guys, so he stashed the drugs he was carrying in the hotel room ceiling. Finally, he had a chance to give Delphi a bit of his attention. Meanwhile, Vic was on the hunt for info about Pete's dad, who was, of course, Donald. From what he gathered, Donald was just known as an old baker. Vic couldn't help but laugh, thinking he was up against someone way weaker. Little did he know, Donald wasn't just any old guy. Even Clara and the police were having a tough time uncovering Donald's identity, which had been a secret for so many years. The next day, Donald was on the move again, this time gathering information about someone named Milky. After finding out where Milky lived, he asked Delphi to stay in the car. With just a box of bread in hand, Donald managed to coax Milky out of his room. Within a minute, he got some info about Pete. Donald was ready to deal with Milky, but unexpectedly, Delphi showed up at Milky's place. This surprised Donald, but in the end, Milky still met his fate at Donald's hands. At night, Donald shared a story with Delphi to help her fall asleep quickly. Once she was asleep, he set out alone to a nightclub, this time in search of a guy named Derek. Before making his move, Donald decided to blend in by disguising himself as a waiter. Eventually, he spotted Derek and followed him to the restroom. At first, Donald played the part of a servant attending to Derek. But once he removed his waiter's jacket, he didn't waste any time and gave Derek a beating. At that time, Donald didn't really want to cause a violence, since he was just after information about Pete. However, Derek was uncooperative and mocked him by calling him the baker. This angered Donald, and he ended up taking Derek down without getting the answers he needed, leaving with just a few injuries and Delphi's cries in his ears. Meanwhile, Vic started piecing together where Donald might be. Even though Donald was feeling somewhat resigned about Pete's situation, he was pretty relaxed. The following day, Donald stepped out to grab some snacks, leaving Delphi busy packing up in the room. Seizing the opportunity, Vic and his crew made their move to the hotel where Donald was staying. They showed a picture of Donald to the hotel receptionist and slipped them some cash for info. Soon after, they figured out which room Donald was in. Good thing Delphi was alert. She quickly hid under the mattress, realizing Donald was still outside. When the timing felt right, she darted out of the hotel room, hopped into Donald's car, and honked the horn. Hearing the horn, Donald sprang into action and dealt with Vic's men, who were after Delphi. Fast forward a bit, and Clara and the police were scratching their heads over a burnt car in front of the hotel. Turns out, Donald accidentally set the car on fire, the same one he'd been using. To make things more puzzling, the car had a fake license plate under Donald's name, but it belonged to a different guy. And the real owner of the car, also named Donald, had passed away 26 years ago. This left Clara and the police even more baffled, trying to unravel the mystery of Donald's true identity. So, on the flip side, Vic and his crew found out that Donald was in the hospital, nursing some wounds from their last encounter. There, Vic spotted Delphi in the hospital corridor and made her lead him to Donald's room. Delphi had no choice but to show them, but she was clever and bought some time so Donald could find a hiding spot. When Vic and his men reached the room Delphi pointed out, Donald was nowhere in sight, even though they were in the right place. Out of the blue, Donald popped up and using just a few items from the room and some slick moves, he took down Vic's men. A little later, Clara and her police squad showed up at the hospital on the lookout for Donald. However, they didn't find him, but they stumbled upon Vic's crew, all out cold from Donald's handiwork. Clara was pretty impressed by what Donald could do. Meanwhile, Donald slipped away and snagged a cell phone from one of Vic's guys. He shot a message to Vic, pretending to be one of his men, saying he got the drugs. Vic, falling for it, told him to meet up ASAP. A bit later, Vic was at the meeting spot and got a real surprise when his car alarm just wouldn't stop blaring. Out of nowhere, Donald showed up and took Vic hostage. He demanded that Vic take him to where Pete's body was. Without wasting time, Vic drove Donald and Delphi to a secret place. Getting there, Donald told Delphi to stay put in the car. When he found out the grim truth about how Pete had met his end, Donald told Vic to prepare himself, making it seem like he was going to finish him off. But when it came down to it, especially with Delphi showing up unexpectedly and witnessing everything, Donald just didn't have it in him to do it. For the first time, he let his enemy walk away. Discovering Pete's fate, Donald decided it was time to leave and take Delphi to another country, keeping the destination a secret from her. Little did they know, an organization had been expecting Donald because, as it turned out, he was a top-notch agent from a big-time international spy agency. But Donald kept this on the down low, choosing to stick to his bread-trading life. The film ends. The moral lesson from this film is never underestimate a baker, because you never know when he might turn out to be a secret spy that can take down criminals.